Hey everyone, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into Denmark's ambitious plan for a greener future. We're talking about a complete transformation of their land use and agriculture, all thanks to, well, a really groundbreaking agreement.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting about this one? It's not just a bunch of policy tweaks here and there. This feels like a whole new chapter for Denmark. It's not every day you see a country essentially decide to rewild itself.
I know, that's exactly what caught my eye when I saw this in the listener suggestions. This one's serious. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. What's the backstory here? How did this agreement even come about? It's not like everyone just woke up one morning and said, let's plant a million trees.
Right. Well, it's actually a fascinating example of collaboration, which you don't always see, especially when it comes to something as complex as this. It wasn't just a top-down mandate. This agreement came about through a really interesting coalition. We're talking the Danish government, farmers' unions, environmental advocacy groups, industrial representatives, even local community groups. They all came together to hammer out a plan for a more sustainable Denmark.
Wow, so it sounds like everyone was at the table for this one. That's impressive. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What does this green Denmark, as they're calling it, actually look like on the ground? What's changing?
Well, picture this. Vast stretches of land that are currently dedicated to intensive farming are going to be transformed. And we're not just talking about a few pilot projects here. We're talking about a significant portion of Denmark's agricultural land-making way for nature to reclaim what was once hers.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What will these reclaimed landscapes actually look like?
Imagine rolling hills covered in heather, meadows buzzing with life, river valleys restored to their natural flow. We're talking about the revival of ecosystems that were once a defining feature of the Danish landscape, but have been, over centuries, slowly converted to farmland. It's like hitting the rewind button on centuries of agricultural expansion.
I have to say, it's a pretty stunning image. But this can't be just about aesthetics, right? This has to be backed by some serious commitment. How are they planning to actually pull this off?
This is where things get really interesting. They've established what they're calling Denmark's Green Area Fund. And it's not just a symbolic gesture either. They've committed a massive 40 billion kroner, that's over 5 billion euros, to make this transformation happen.
Wow, that's a hefty chunk of change. I'm starting to understand why people are calling this a Green New Deal moment for Denmark. But hold on, 5 billion euros. That's a lot of trees. What are they actually spending it on? Break it down for me.
Well, think of it as a multi-pronged approach to, revitalizing Denmark's environment.
Right.
One of the major focuses is afforestation.
Afforestation. Remind me what that one is again.
Basically planting trees, a lot of trees. We're talking about planting a whopping 250,000 hectares of new forest by 2045.
Okay, so that's a lot of trees. Like, a lot. But forests aren't the only thing on the agenda, right?
Right. There's another crucial ecosystem they're focusing on. Peatlands. You see, peatlands are like these giant carbon sinks.
Carbon sinks. You mean they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere?
Exactly. And they're incredibly effective at it. Way more so than forests, actually. The problem is peatlands around the world have been drained and degraded, which is actually a big contributor to climate change. So Denmark is going all in on restoring them. We're talking about bringing 140,000 hectares of peatlands back to life by 2030.
Okay, so we've got forests, peatlands. It's starting to sound like a nature documentary up in here. But let's be real, this can't be just about creating pretty landscapes, right? There's got to be an economic angle to all of this.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the farmers come in.
Because, let's face it, Denmark has a long and proud history of agricultural production. It's a big part of their economy and identity.
Exactly. And this plan doesn't just push them aside. It actually recognizes their crucial role and incorporates them into this vision for a greener Denmark.
So they're not kicking farmers off their land and replacing them with, like, windmills and wildflowers?
Not at all. This plan actually positions farmers as key players in this ecological restoration. Think of it as farmers becoming land managers.
Land managers. So they're trading in their tractors for, well, maybe not tractors, but they're taking on a more holistic role.
Precisely. They're being tasked with using their expertise to not only produce food, but to restore and maintain these new landscapes. It's about recognizing that farmers have a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the land, and it's about leveraging that knowledge for the benefit of the environment.
That makes a lot of sense. Instead of seeing farmers as part of the problem, they're saying, hey, you've got the skills and the knowledge, let's make you part of the solution.
Exactly. It's a really interesting approach.
So we've covered the vision, the investment, and the role of farmers. But what about the environmental challenges Denmark is already facing? I know their waterways, especially those along the coast, are really struggling with pollution.
You're right, that's a major issue, and the agreement directly addresses it.
Okay, good, because I was going to say.
They're not shying away from the tough problems. One of the key strategies they're employing is what they call area adjustment. Basically, it means they're going to strategically shift land use away from intensive farming in areas that are particularly vulnerable, especially those impacting water quality.
So, less intensive farming in areas that are critical for water health. That seems, well, logical.
Right. It's about recognizing that different areas have different ecological needs and vulnerabilities.
Makes sense. But who gets to make those decisions? I imagine there could be some debate about which areas are most vulnerable and how these changes are actually implemented.
And you'd be right, there's always a risk of a top-down approach backfiring, so they're doing things a bit differently. They're emphasizing local empowerment in this area.
Local empowerment. So it's not just some bureaucrat in Copenhagen drawing lines on a map.
Exactly. The plan specifically gives local communities, especially those in coastal areas, as well as water management groups, a much more significant role in shaping and implementing these changes.
Interesting. So it's about finding solutions that work for both the environment and the people who live and work in those areas.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work when you're dealing with something as complex as, well, an entire ecosystem.
I like it. It's refreshing to see a plan that takes those nuances into account. This is already a lot to digest, and we've only just scratched the surface.
There's a lot more to unpack.
We haven't even touched on climate change, which I know is a huge focus for Denmark. They have some of the most ambitious climate goals in the world, don't they?
They do, and this agreement lays out a pretty bold roadmap for reaching them.
Bold? How so?
Well, for one, they're introducing a CO2e tax on livestock emissions starting in 2030.
Wait, hold on. A tax on cow burps? That's a pretty bold move. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's about incentivizing a shift towards more climate-friendly farming practices. This tax will be introduced gradually and increase over time, sending a clear signal to the agricultural sector that sustainability is the future.
So it's a carrot and stick approach. Encourage the good and, well, let's just say discourage the not so good.
In a nutshell, yes. They're also investing heavily in innovation and technology, particularly in something called pyrolysis.
Pyrolysis. That one went right over my head. What is that exactly?
It's actually pretty cool. It's a way to capture carbon by heating organic materials like plant and animal waste.
So turning waste into something useful and capturing carbon in the process.
Exactly. The agreement includes a dedicated fund to incentivize the adoption of pyrolysis technology. They're really betting that this could be a game changer when it comes to reducing agricultural emissions, maybe even achieving negative emissions down the line.
Wow, negative emissions from farming. That's like next level stuff. It seems like they're not just focused on reducing emissions, but also on the bigger picture of what we eat.
You're picking up on a really important point there.
Am I?
Yeah, because they're also increasing funding for the Fund for Plant-Based Foods to support the development and promotion of, you guessed it, plant-based alternatives.
So it's about shifting diets toward more sustainable choices. Less meat, more veggies. Sounds like a win-win for the planet and our health. But what about the farmers? How will these changes affect their livelihoods? And what about Denmark's overall food production? Those are pretty big questions, right?
They are. And that's exactly what we'll be digging into next. We'll explore how this agreement aims to balance a greener Denmark with, well, making sure everyone still has food on their plates.
So we've talked about Denmark's big green vision, but now I'm curious about the impact on their food production. I mean, they're converting a good chunk of farmland for these ecological projects. Can they still grow enough to feed themselves, or are we all going to be snacking on imported Danish moss?
That's the question on everyone's mind, right? Like, is a greener Denmark going to mean less food on the table? It's a fair question. But what's interesting is this agreement actually addresses that concern head on.
Okay, so they're not ditching farms entirely. Phew, that's a relief. But how do they reconcile that with taking land out of production?
It's about working smarter, not necessarily harder. The plan really emphasizes boosting efficiency and investing in technologies that can help increase yields on the remaining farmland. It's about getting more from less, but in a sustainable way.
So more crop per drop, so to speak. It sounds like a big ask, but also a huge opportunity for innovation in agriculture. But this brings up another question for me. Won't this just shift the burden? Like, if Denmark needs to import less food, great. But what if other countries have to ramp up their production to fill the gap? Wouldn't that lead to more deforestation or harmful practices elsewhere?
That's a really sharp observation, and it highlights how interconnected our global food systems really are. And you're right, simply shifting the environmental burden wouldn't be a real solution. That's why this agreement actually stresses international collaboration.
So it's not enough for Denmark to just clean up its own act. They want to lead by example and work with other countries to make the whole system more sustainable.
Exactly. It's about sharing knowledge, technology, and best practices, especially with developing nations that are, facing their own food security and environmental challenges.
It's about recognizing that we're all connected in this, from the fields of Denmark to farms across the globe. Okay, but let's zoom back in on Denmark for a minute. This whole shift to a greener model, it's got to have ripple effects on the economy, right?
Mhm.
What about the farmers themselves? How are they reacting to this big change?
It's true. Anytime you have such a significant shift, there are going to be adjustments. But remember, this agreement was crafted with input from all stakeholders, and that very much includes farmers' unions and agricultural representatives. Their voices were heard throughout the process.
So it wasn't just imposed on them from above, they were at the table helping to shape the plan.
Exactly. And that's actually reflected in how the agreement positions farmers. It explicitly recognizes their expertise, not just in producing food, but also as stewards of the land, guardians of Denmark's natural heritage, if you will.
Right, we talked about that earlier, this idea of the farmer as a land manager. It's not about taking their livelihoods away, but about giving them a new, vital role in this greener Denmark.
Precisely. The agreement really sees the future of farming as inseparable from the health of the environment. And who better to manage that delicate balance than the people who've dedicated their lives to working the land?
Makes sense. Farmers have always been adaptable, resourceful, and, let's be honest, deeply connected to the land. Now, they're being asked to be at the forefront of this environmental transformation. But all of these changes, from reforestation to peatland restoration, it all requires resources, funding, a whole lot of coordination. How are they actually going to put this plan into action?
That's where this Denmark's Green Area Fund really comes into play. This isn't just a symbolic gesture. It's a massive commitment of financial resources, a war chest for ecological transformation.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier, but give us the numbers again. Just how much are we talking about?
We're talking about 40 billion kroners. That's over 5 billion euros. To put that in perspective, it's like every single person in Denmark chipping in over 650 euros to make their country greener.
Wow, that's serious money. So this isn't just about planting a few trees here and there. It's about a complete overhaul of how they manage their land.
Exactly. And it's not just about one-time projects either. The Green Area Fund is designed to be a long-term investment strategy for a more sustainable future.
So walk me through how this fund actually works. Where exactly is all that money going?
Well, it's not as simple as just dividing up the money evenly. It's about strategically investing it across a range of initiatives. For example, a significant portion is allocated to the afforestation effort. Remember those 250,000 hectares of new forest?
Yeah, that's going to take a lot more than just a handful of acorns.
Right. It requires a lot of saplings, a lot of land, and a lot of careful planning to make sure those trees actually thrive. And then there's the peatland restoration, which requires significant investment as well. But it goes beyond just planting trees and restoring peat bogs. This fund is also intended to support the creation of wetlands, incentivize farmers to adopt more sustainable practices, like reducing livestock numbers in certain areas, promoting crop rotation, things like that. And crucially, it'll facilitate strategic land acquisition.
Land acquisition. Does that mean the government's going to be, buying up farmland?
In some cases, yes. But it's not about taking land away from farmers. It's about strategic consolidation, acquiring land to create larger, more ecologically viable areas. Think about it. A few small nature preserves scattered here and there, they're not nearly as effective as one large interconnected ecosystem.
That's a good point. So it's about creating a landscape that's more resilient, more biodiverse, and ultimately more beneficial for both the environment and the people who live there. This is an incredibly ambitious plan. But with such a massive undertaking, there are bound to be challenges.
Of course, there are always challenges, and that's what makes this whole endeavor so fascinating. It's a grand experiment, a bold attempt to reshape a nation's relationship with its environment.
And speaking of challenges, we haven't even touched on the potential downsides of this plan. Are there any risks, any unintended consequences they need to be wary of? That's the billion kroner question, isn't it? This whole plan, it sounds amazing on paper, restoring nature, making farming greener, all of it. But even with the best intentions, there are always trade-offs. What could go wrong here?
You're absolutely right to consider the potential downsides. Anytime you're talking about this scale of change, there are bound to be, well, bumps in the road.
So, what are the speed bumps we should be looking out for?
One concern that often comes up is the economic impact on specific sectors. The agreement does include provisions to support farmers during this transition, but there could definitely be some short-term disruptions. Some farmers might need to adapt to new practices, maybe even new crops, while others might decide to move away from traditional agriculture altogether.
It's not as simple as like flipping a switch and suddenly everything's green. There are real people whose lives are intertwined with the current system.
Exactly. And we need to acknowledge that. There could also be social impacts, especially in rural communities where, agriculture has always been the heart and soul. These communities might need to reinvent themselves, which, of course, presents both challenges and opportunities. It's crucial to make sure they have the support they need throughout this whole process.
It's about making sure no one gets left behind in the rush towards a greener future, right? But what about the environmental side of things? Are there any risks there? I mean, nature can be unpredictable.
Absolutely. Ecosystems are complex. And honestly, it's impossible to predict every outcome with, 100% certainty. There's always a chance that some interventions, despite our best efforts, might not play out exactly as we intended.
So it's all a bit of an experiment then. In a way, yes. But that's why ongoing monitoring and evaluation are built into this plan. They'll be tracking progress very closely and, importantly, making adjustments along the way.
So it's not just, here's the plan, let's do it. It's more like, here's the roadmap, let's navigate it smartly and adapt as we go.
Exactly. And that's actually what I find most exciting about this whole agreement. It's a dynamic approach, a commitment to continuous learning, and to being willing to adapt and improve. It's not just about achieving this fixed set of targets, but about embarking on a journey toward a more sustainable future and being honest with ourselves about what works and what doesn't.
I have to admit, my inner skeptic is having a hard time poking holes in this plan. It sounds like they've really thought this through. They've certainly done their homework. But beyond the specifics of the plan itself, I think the most important takeaway is Denmark's willingness to, well, to actually take action. They're not just talking about sustainability, they're making it happen.
And not just with these tiny incremental steps, but with a giant leap. It's like they're sending a message to the world. This is what a real commitment to a greener future looks like.
Precisely. And it really makes you wonder, if Denmark can do it, why not others? What lessons can other countries, heck, even individuals, take away from this bold experiment?
It's a powerful question to consider. So as you're out there navigating your own little corner of the world, think about the changes you'd like to see. What would it take to create a greener version of your own community, your workplace, your lifestyle?
It all starts with asking those questions, with imagining a different future, and with believing that change, even radical change, is possible.
Denmark's story is a powerful reminder that we're not powerless in the face of these global challenges. We have the capacity to create solutions, to innovate, to build a better future, one green step at a time.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the possibilities. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.